Here are 9 color grades I've done with variant styles. There's been a new emerging technology by Color Lab AI, which is interested by Disney and Warner Brothers. It focuses mostly on reducing the technical aspect of grading, like balancing the colors to let the artist the creative aspect of the grading much quicker. This artifact is demonstrating the importance of color grading as of directed to set up the mood, tone, and overall atmosphere of the story, using colors from range of cool, warm, to set up the overall mood of the scene, from saturated to desaturated, of the tone of the story, depending on which is important for directors to understand what kind of look they want with the colors of the scene. First up, before you start color grading, you want to change the timeline color space in DaVinci to DaVinci VH Intermediate, so you have a wider range of color space to adjust, allowing more camera profile and color space to adjust in the settings without being limited to it. And the output color space depends on the monitor you're using, which ideally for me, I want the Rec 709. This is a log footage filmed in Japan using a Panasonic GH4. The first step you want to do is convert the first node into a color space using whatever settings you had on the camera, which mine is a Panasonic GH4, which I adjusted the input color space into Panasonic V Gamut, input gamma Panasonic Vlog, output color space DaVinci Wide Gamut, output gamma DaVinci Intermediate, which will create not much huge difference in the look, but which you need to convert the last node into input color space DaVinci Wide Gamut, input gamma DaVinci Intermediate, output color space Rec 709, output gamma 2.4 to feed into what we're gonna view at the end product once we adjust all the settings to have a look like what the camera captured in the footage. This whole node tree was learned from Darren Mostyn, who's a professional color artist in the industry who's been producing a lot of commercial projects as well as some short projects in the industry for BBC and so on, and Amazon. The first step is to balance and exposure of the scene. As you can tell, it's overall bluish and overexposed with the highlights, which are converted in the HDR settings, which stand for high dynamic range color wheels, which decrease the exposure of the global, which is overall image, and went to the primary color wheels, adjusting the colors using the gains, reducing the highlights blue and the green in the mid-tone, using and reducing the blue in the shadows. I learned this reading the Color Grading 101 by Charles Haine, as it teaches you about the purpose of each color wheels and how to read the parade to color grade accurately of the scopes. Once you've done that, you want to move into the contrast, as you want to have broadened the contrast of the image. In the Color Grade 101, it teaches you about the S-curves of the footage to create the most contrast without leaking the blending, pushing the color about too far out, where it will leak out to what is actually possible. As you can see here, if I extend it, it looks blown out. But overall, this is what it would look like if it's properly color graded, like balance and exposure, and done contrast properly. Here is a scene that I filmed in Japan for my short film, where it's supposed to be a drama, ideally, which is like Her, where it's more like, it's not a super heavy story, but it's a drama nevertheless, where I done all the color spacing, put a lot over it, and use balancing the exposure and contrast, and lower the saturation a bit. And now it's the more fine tuning of the grading, which is like color temperature of the scene, which you can see in the primary section here. I increased it to be a more warmer tone. And then HDR is like, I made some adjustment in the saturation, in the highlights. And then Warper is more of the curvature in the other section, like hue versus hue, hue versus saturation, if you want to do a specific color change. And then the curves, I made some adjustments in this saturation versus lumen, which I increased, made it a bit more brighter in the highlights section in the central area. Then trim is like adjusting the overall image all at once, combining all those small adjustments to one node, which I made some adjustment with where I adjusted the contrast and the pivot, the contrast of the image. As you can see in Her, it's like not as very contrasty. Then I created a power window using the circle for the skin tone, as I want to adjust the skin tone of the scenes, which power windows, like creating each node for new power window to make it more easier to identify which one is which. Which you do that, create one, and then adjust the using tracking system to make sure it tracks the footage. And you use the vector scope, which is this line that tells you where the skin tone color is at, which I adjusted it to be a bit more lighter. As you can tell, my face is very dark and red, so I reduced that overall. I didn't take action, I used as a small adjustment in my face to reduce the overall contrast a bit more without affecting the background. Then here's a more darker tone story. If you're trying to create a revenge story like Revenant, which is not the main, unless if you're going for a darker tone story, this is a very good color grade to use a darker tone, a more colder temperature overall. And then if you're trying to make a more light-hearted story like Moonrise Kingdom, you can use more warmer lights while also have a softer contrast. And overall, this is supposed to be more like old timesake, so that's why it's more less saturated, as in with the brightness of the colors. It's supposed to emulate the film look to it. But I don't have the DaVinci FreeSpace, DaVinci paid version to have access to those textures. But then overall, here's a more warmer tone. If you want to create a more like a sunset kind of vibe for like a tourist video, or if you want to try to create a noir type of film using a darker tone, black and white, adjusting the changing into a monochrome saturation and increase the red output, like how they did it with a Lighthouse, where they reduced the color channel, which is where the inspiration came, using the red output instead to darken the shadows.